So this paper is on e-cigarettes. You'll see the acronym ENDS show up shortly to refer to those, and smoking. We will be using data from the Republic of Korea and looking at the relationships between correlation and causation and the severe selection bias that we find. And the funder, it's important to note, is Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. And Anna Choi at Sejong University, also at Pepperdine University at the time of this work, hopefully will be joining us as well. Okay, so first of all, this is a policy issue in health economics. The question is, do e-cigarettes help or hurt people to quit smoking? And the smoking rate, for example, in Korea is still quite high. So for men, it's 35%. So more than 1 in 3 are still smoking. These are adult men, which puts them at about the 80th percentile across the countries tracked by the WHO. Now, it is certainly true, and you'll see in a graph in a moment, that the standard elements of the tobacco control playbook have brought that rate down a lot. But it appears that progress might be diminishing. And so the question is, can we make use of a new technology like e-cigarettes to help continue with improving cessation, or does that just delay people quitting smoking? I will use the acronym ENDS, Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems, to refer both to e-cigarettes, which is most of what our data cover, but also more recently, there's this thing called heated tobacco. You might have heard of a project called IQOS, for example, which is another form of e-cigarettes, although they typically don't use that word for them. Now, it's important to note that the official policy stance from the Ministry of Health in Korea is very negative towards ENDS. And in part, that's because of this first point here. If you just do a brain dead regression in a cross section, take a bunch of guys and regress on whether they smoke, regress that on a bunch of controls, as we will do shortly, and e-cigarette usage, you will find that they are highly, statistically significantly, positively correlated. So it looks like ENDS causes smoking, if you believe that there's anything causal there. But the point is, of course, as econometricians, we know that ENDS are not randomly sprinkled over an observational study like that. It's not an experiment. And so this issue of selection into treatment, the fact that ENDS use is a choice, is very, very important here. So then the question is, what type of people are choosing to use them, and might that bias results from these naive regressions? So that's what we investigate in this study. First, we'll establish that correlation, as many other studies have shown, but then we'll try to move beyond that by using effects, by using models to identify causal treatment effects. And so here's what we do in our study. We will measure smoking and ENDS use in Korea using their version of the NHANES data set. We'll demonstrate that the two are positively correlated, talk about why there is probably selection bias and what form it might take in the population of users. And then we'll show some evidence for that selection bias getting worse after 2015, when the government came out with an extremely negative health report and recommendations on ENDS. And there are various things that we will show there. And then finally, and briefly, I will return to a suite of causal treatment effect models that we estimate. So here is what the time trend for adult male smoking looks like in Korea. And you can see that there's been, from one point of view, remarkable success over the last several decades. You're starting from a situation where nearly everyone smoked, 4 out of 5 men. A lot of them picked up the habit in the army, where they were offered free cigarettes, and there was a strong smoking culture and compulsory service. Come out of that, and many of them still smoked. The rate has dropped to 35% in 2018. Here's a close-up view of the last few years of that graph. Now notice, now part of this is just sampling variation in the K-NHANES data, but not all of it. So for example, there's a big tax increase in 2015. And so you do see smoking fall, as we would expect, but notice this rebound the next year. And I'll say a little bit more about what was going on with the e-cigarette side of things. It helps explain that as well. But the short story is, it appears a lot of people substituted away from cigarettes towards e-cigarettes, and that brought down the smoking rate. But then the government came out and said, not so fast, you shouldn't be doing that. And then the smoking rate went back up. And in the public health literature, this is what we call unintended consequences. So here is what e-cigarette and heated tobacco use looks like in Korea, again, for adult males. Usage is quite low. So if you notice the scale over here, not many people are using these products. And this is in contrast with some other Asian countries like Japan. This is much lower than the US or the UK as well. Now, here's the impact of that negative report that I mentioned from the government. They came out, it's a very interesting report. It basically said certain things and then drew certain conclusions that don't follow from those facts that they presented. So the facts were that they found some nasty substances in e-cigarettes. The conclusions that they drew from them, at least in English translation, they said you should not use e-cigarettes for cessation from smoking, and you cannot use e-cigarettes for cessation from smoking, neither of which is quite true. So you do see, this is a huge drop. It drops by about half in 2016. And of course, that corresponds with the time when the smoking rate went back up. Now, why are people using these things? Well, notice that most of the usage, at least what people say, is that it is to quit smoking. So that's the bottom set of bars down here in the graph. And notice we're comparing 2015 to 2016. And so notice when the government report comes out saying you cannot and should not use these products to quit smoking, a lot fewer people say they were using them to quit smoking. Makes sense. Who's using them? Of course, there is a lot of fear, particularly in the US, that our kids are going to take these up or that never smokers will be enticed into usage. Now, I should note up front, we don't really have much to say about the youth. We're just not studying that in this study. But at least if you look among 19-year-olds and older, the legal smoking age in the country, you can see from the graph here that nearly all usage is by current and former smokers. And of course, many of those former smokers have quit. Not that they quit and then took up ends. It's that they were dual users for a while. I don't have that directly in the chart here. But only 3% are used by people who are just experimenting with this new form of nicotine and they weren't smokers before. Okay, so now let's turn to the sort of result that is rife in the public health literature as done by non-economists. You have dozens of studies in Korea and elsewhere around the world where they will just regress, run regressions on observational data sets, cross-sectional survey data. So here's an example of those. These are results showing the marginal effects from a probit regression, controlling for many things, 26 different demographic variables, year fixed effects since we have repeated cross sections, and region fixed effects in case there are price differences and so forth. And the dependent variable here is current smoking status. And here are just the two key regressors of interest. And so if you believe these results were causal, you would say, wow, if someone is currently smoking e-cigarettes, then that's 25 percentage points more likely that they're smokers. Must be something there. If they had past ends use only, you also see a strong positive and significant effect. And so studies like these have affected, of course, the public health ministry's views on these things. But now as economists, we are always thinking about selection effects and whether something is an experiment, whether if it isn't, how we can create an experiment somehow or use some method that might get at a causal effect. So for simplicity, let's just assume that there's two types of people, although of course there are a continuum. Type 1 individuals, think of these as the hardcore smokers for whom quitting will be very difficult. And also, maybe they don't even want to quit. They might have genetic or social factors that give them a higher addiction potential. And these are the sorts of people that, because of these unobserved individual factors, they're more likely to smoke. They're probably also more likely to use e-cigarettes. Why? Well, you can use them in some cases when you can't smoke. And so if you're heavily addicted, it might be a legal way or a more convenient way or a less bothersome way to others for you to get nicotine. So even if there's no actual causal effect between the two, shown by the dotted arrow between the two boxes on the right, you would see a strong positive correlation between the two. Now imagine there's a second type of smoker or type of person who, again, because of genetic factors or whatever, is less likely to smoke, less likely to become heavily addicted if they do smoke, and if they do smoke, have a strong desire to quit. And just for the sake of argument, we'll show this with data later, let's assume that there is actually a negative causal effect, that e-cigarettes would actually help this type of person quit smoking. Well, because of the factors that we talked about for the type 1 individual, you still might see a positive correlation between the two, but it probably will be lower, or it might even be negative. Now, of course, what we will be interested in is trying to estimate the arrow over here on the right. What is the actual causal effect between the two? So first, before running that causal treatment effects regression, let's look at some indirect evidence for this selection bias story. So in 2015, when the health ministry announced that e-cigarettes were dangerous to health, and by the way, I didn't mention before that it was actually, I think, a bit disingenuous the way they worded the press release, because they said, we found some bad chemicals in certain e-cigarette brands, and they implied, without stating, because the statement is actually false, even by their own study, but they implied that therefore e-cigarettes are just as harmful as smoking, which the literature is very clear on is highly unlikely to be the case. They're not risk-free, but they do represent harm reduction. Okay, so if you compare 2014 before that statement to 2016, a year after the dust has settled, you can tell a story that e-cigarette use might have shifted toward that type 1 user. So for example, if you look at who is using them, you see all these demographic characteristics that the public health literature associates with higher addiction and more difficulty quitting. Older smokers, lower income, less educated, more binge drinkers, people that are in worse self-reported health. And so you do, and so I'm relying here on work by Emily Oster. She has pointed out that when you see changes in observables in a population like this, there's probably a signal that the unobservables driving things have shifted as well. Then you can also rerun that probit that I did before and show that those apparent positive coefficients on ends use go up a lot. Again, evidence that something shifted. Okay, so now for econometric fun. We estimate many versions of this 2-equation system. And so this model goes by many, many names in the literature. For example, if I were assuming a bivariate probit distribution, this could be called the recursive probit model or the triangular probit model. But basically, it's just a treatment effects model with 2 twists. One, the outcome is binary, smoking, yes, no. Although in our case, it will actually be cessation, quitting smoking, yes, no. And the treatment is endogenous. It's not a random experiment. Okay, so this first equation, variable D is just, have you used ends in the last 8 years, which kind of, you can read the paper for why that time period. And that, of course, is a binary variable. And then the outcome is cessation, not smoking. So it's the opposite. So perhaps, unfortunately, we have to shift our thinking now. You see this tau in the second equation. Tau is going to be, well, by definition, it is the causal treatment effect. And so if we find something positive and significant, that would mean that ends appear to be causally associated with less smoking, with more cessation. And the error terms in these 2 equations, if they are non-zero, then there are selection effects. Okay, so what do we estimate? Well, we start with the bivariate probit version of this model. That's the one that's built into everyone's software pretty much these days. But then, since we don't want to just identify things off functional form, or if we do, we don't want to just do it with one functional form. We want to run a horse race between many different models to see if the results are robust or fragile. We do some other things. So Copula modeling, if you haven't run across that before, that is a way to bind together any two marginal distributions you want. And so it gives you a very flexible way to check out many different types of correlational structures. And so we look at two Copula models, the Frank model and the Clayton model. We estimate what's called a mouthful, a semi-non-parametric model. This postulates that the error terms, you basically just say, okay, we don't know what they are. They might not be more normal. So the same way that we could do, a Taylor polynomial or some sort of polynomial approximation of a function, let's use what are called Hermite polynomials to essentially non-parametrically estimate the bivariate distribution of the error terms. And then Wooldridge in recent years also has a new control function model for this setting as well. So the target, so we estimate all of those and many versions of all of those. Our target of estimation is the ATET, the average treatment effect on the treated. Why not the 8? Well, we're not so interested in grabbing a random person out of the population and seeing what happens. We actually want to know, well, okay, for the people who actually chose to use these products, did it help or hurt them? We also estimate 8, but I won't cover those in the paper today. And then we have a formal way to select among models. Okay, so here's the one table of results. So the things to notice here is that the ATET pretty consistently is estimated to be positive and statistically significant, which means that there does seem to be evidence in the causal direction that ends actually help people quit smoking in Korea in this context. Correlation is negative between the two equations, which essentially just means that the sort of selection into treatment effects, the story that we had in mind, that gives rise to this negative coefficient. And so it's not proof that that story is right, but it is consistent with it. So the thing that I don't really show here on the table is how to select which of these models are best. But depending on the subset of models you're looking at, the ones in bold would be the ones that the selection criteria selected. So just to summarize those results, the preferred estimates of that average treatment effect on the treated are in the range of 10.3 to almost 17 percentage points greater cessation from using ends rather than not. And so it does appear that policymakers may be being led astray by simplistic correlational analysis. And these results would also suggest that there would be pretty severe selection bias among any observational study that didn't try to correct for that selection effect. I think personally that the South Korean government has really missed an opportunity here to do some of the things that some other countries have done. So for example, in the UK, I have 45 seconds here, so I'll close with this briefly. They take a much more positive view, and they actually guide people through using e-cigarettes to help them get off of smoking. And again, in a way that tries to keep them away from youth. But there are some good examples of places where they have innovatively been used as part of the modern cessation toolkit. And so I guess our results would suggest that that could be useful here as well. Okay, thank you. Let me stop my screen share. And I think David will now discuss.
Okay, can you listen me, James?
I'm sorry?
Can you listen me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
First of all, congratulations, James, for the presentation made now. I'm sorry because I am not a specialist in this topic, but highlight the clarity in the literature review because he's made me position in the current situation of the literature. I have some question about this paper. First, when you explain the survey used in this paper, you explain the sample design, but I don't find if this survey is representative at national level, regional level, or urban-rural level. Also, I have does the survey have information about, for example, parents' education or habits, smoking habits of the parents of these individuals in order, for example, to control for household behavior? These variables contribute to explain this behavior of the individuals. Another question is if the final results change with when the total adult sample is used in the regression instead of only men. And finally, for me, it's very interesting to see how there is a low percentage that women represent among smokers, and that this percentage has remained practically constant over this period. What factors explain this behavior and this huge difference between men and women?
Let me just give you some really brief answers, because I think your questions are very right on and interesting. First, for the representativeness of the study. So if anyone has used the NHANES health data set in the US, this Korean version is modeled on that, which means that it is a fully appropriately probability-based sample, and there are good survey weights. So we use weights in all of our regressions, in all of our statistics. And so every figure that you see in the paper is weighted to represent the target population of the non-institutionalized, in our case, adult male population. Is there data on smoking characteristics like smoking in the home and so forth? Yes, although we haven't included those. So there's some stuff that we could explore there. In this version of the paper, we tried to stay from anything that potentially could be endogenous. And so we just focused on basic demographics, but that would be very interesting as well. Low percentage of women who smoke, why? I think two things very briefly. The sociology of smoking in Asia and in Korea in particular has a lot to say about the role of the perceived view of a woman who smokes. Traditionally, that would have been something that, for example, prostitutes did back in the early 20th century. And so there's all sorts of stigma of what an ideal Asian desirable bride-to-be might look like. And it's still a very, it's still a culture, perhaps less among the younger, but it still is a culture that's very influenced by some more rigid notions of what women shouldn't do. And I wish, oh, there's Anna, so she can chime in later if she wants on that, but I've learned a lot about that from her. And then also, we don't believe that they answer honestly. Because of that stigma, there is some good evidence that the women don't answer the smoking question truthfully. And so that's another reason that we just don't even use those statistics, is we don't believe them. And I know you had at least one other point that I did not touch on.
Is the final results change when you use the total sample, the total adult sample instead of only men?
Oh, so that's actually what we did in the first version of this paper. And I guess it won't surprise anyone, since the female smoking is so low and the sample is limited to current and past smokers, it really doesn't matter if we include the women, because they're just like a minor little distraction in the data. So, and I wouldn't even say that that's nice for the robustness of our results. I think I just view it as almost irrelevant, especially since I don't really believe the veracity of the data for the women.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we have 2 or 3 minutes if anyone has any other questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So from a policy standpoint, if you were advising a regional or national government in Korea, or for that matter, anywhere else, it's clear that cigarettes kill, probably one of the few products known to kill with probability 1. The only question is how long will it take? E-cigarettes are bad, but not so bad. What would you advise a government that is trying to really wean its population off of smoking completely? Would you say e-cigarettes, but then something else? Would you say a patch? Would you recommend taxing?
Right.
What is the single best policy instrument?
So from the literature, I think there are actually 2 apparent answers from randomized controlled trials. One is varenicline, which is a drug that basically takes away, if I'm getting my drugs correctly, it takes away the pleasure of smoking. And varenicline is the best drug that's available. And Korea has done exactly the right thing there. They have an excellent public health, public insurance system. And so you can get insurance covered varenicline because of course they want you to stop smoking and they're willing to pay for that to happen. Interestingly enough, there have been 10, at last count, randomized controlled trials of e-cigarettes and their role in cessation around the world, only one of which was done in Korea, but it is one of the ones that found that the cessation effects appear to be on the same order of magnitude with varenicline. And so my first message to any government would be look around the world and look at the places where they've found a way to integrate ends into a positive drive towards cessation. Yes, try the patches, try the drugs, but not everyone has responded to those. And so we're ending up with these pockets of smokers who, for whatever reason, might want to try something else or might need to try something else. So I would say don't rule it out a priori, as they seem to have done in that country in a way that they haven't in many other places.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Rachel looks like she wants to.
I was just unmuting myself. So I don't know how they do it in the UK, but would you recommend that it be a prescription only access to e-cigarettes or not?
Great question. I don't know. I don't know. Certainly you want to keep them out of the hands of children. Certainly you want to keep them out of the hands of young people, but then if the young people are already smoking, then it becomes less clear. I tend to say no, because as soon as you do that, you really cut down on product innovation. And one of the reasons why smokers like to adopt some of these products is that it feels and has the effect more like smoking than a patch or the drugs do. So, we're economists, we know it's all about trade-offs. I think the way to look at it is, I personally, from my extensive review of this literature now, would view it as a win if somebody even smoked less and used e-cigarettes more. Like even if they didn't totally quit, just because there's this notion of harm reduction. I mean, the official statement from Public Health England is that e-cigarettes are 95% safer than smoking, which is, we can quibble about that number. They were really just trying to make the point that it's probably on the order of 20 times safer than smoking. So anything you can do toward that end is probably going to result in harm reduction.
I mean, one of the issues seems to be that different cigarettes have different e-cigarettes have different chemicals, and also depending on which cartridge you buy. Yeah. And I wonder why there's not a more robust, we need to regulate.
Well, so there is in the US. I don't know if you guys follow any of this, but all e-cigarettes have to be regulated in the US. And we've just been in this period of the last 18 months of the FDA collecting all the information. And so we're kind of in this in between time right now, but we're definitely moving there, and they have to disclose all their ingredients and tests and so forth. But okay, so I don't want to take up too much time. So my half hour is up. So let's move to David, who will be speaking on child health in South Africa. and afterward to be discussed by Rachel.
Hello everyone, my name is David. I am a PhD student from the University of La Laguna, and I am going to present this paper, Child Health Inequality and Opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa, co-authored with Gustavo Marrero and Sara Darias. This presentation is divided in several parts. First, an introduction about the context of this paper. Next, I explain the data and the methodology used. Then I'll present the main results of this paper, and finally the conclusions. In order to motivate the interest of this paper, and notice that in spite of evidences of health convergence worldwide, the differences between Sub-Saharan Africa and the other regions in terms of many health variables remains large. In this line, according with the last report of the World Health Organization, Sub-Saharan Africa is the worst region in terms of health. Also, there is much evidence supporting the relationship between child health and circumstances and the effects of child health on future outcomes during adulthood. And according with the conclusions, health inequality begins at birth. Hence, correcting it during childhood is crucial to improve future opportunities and fight against other forms of inequality during adulthood. However, few papers have analyzed child health inequality in Sub-Saharan Africa. Most of them are for a single country, and they don't look at to differences in health along the age distribution for children below 5 years old. Our paper contributes to fill these gaps. More specific, for a sample of 33 sub-Saharan countries, we estimate health inequality and health inequality of opportunity for children below 5 years old, and show their differences by cohorts. Next, for each of these countries, we analyze if the initial levels of inequality in the younger cohort are accentuated with the age or are maintained. And finally, we use a decomposition approach in order to characterize the type of circumstances affecting health inequality of opportunity along the age distribution. Regarding to the data used, we consider the demographic and health surveys using a sample of 33 sub-Saharan countries covering the period 2009 and 2016. DHAs contain information about population, health, and nutrition comparable between countries, and it provides representative household surveys at national, regional, and urban-rural level. We use information for children below 5 years old, divided in 5 cohorts. The sample size on average is 5,000 children per country, and always in our analysis we take into account the sample design of the surveys. In this point, we measure child health using child height, because this is a good indicator of general health status in children, because the evidence show a high correlation between child height and adult outcomes, and also because child height is strictly comparable between children and countries. Next, we measure health inequality following Pradhan et al., which transform the actual height of the children into a standardized height in this manner, using the height for age seat score that is a measure of the differences between the height of the child and the height of the healthy reference child for the same sex and age, transform this z-score into an equivalent height for a girl with 24 months of age with the same z-score. For example, a male child of 40 months with this height have a z-score of minus 3.77, and the equivalent height for a female of 24 months with the same z-score that the boy is this height. However, this reference of girls at 24 months is arbitrary, and moreover, the resultant height still shows a strong correlation with the child age and the gender. And since we don't want to measure inequality generated by these variables, we remove the effect caused by these variables in our measure of height. In this manner, we regress our height, our measure of height with gender, the structure, the age structure of the children, the cross effects, and also we control for regional fixed effects in order to control for potential differences in the distribution of age and gender between the regions of these countries. Then we remove the effects of gender and age in our measure of height, and finally our measure of total inequality is the Gini index of this adjusted height. And then we measure inequality of opportunity adopting the ex-ante parametric approach proposed in Ferreira and Guignou, estimating the following reduced form that relate our adjusted height with a K-type of circumstances, which are factors beyond the individual controls. And using this estimation, we obtain a smooth child height distribution. And then applying an inequality measure or an inequality index to our smooth child height distribution, we obtain our measure of health inequality of opportunity. The set of circumstances that we use are common to all countries, and we classify these circumstances in 5 groups: family background, socio-demographic factors of the mother, household structure, household facilities, and geography. At this point, I'll present first the main results of our paper for the overall sample. For children between 0 and 5 years old. We present the results for the Gini index. Also, the results for the mean log deviation, for example, are similar to the Gini index. In this graphic, we can see how the estimated health inequality range are between 2.5% and 5% of the Gini index that are similar to other previous estimates in the literature. Then, after we regress our reduced form, we can obtain the estimate of health inequality of opportunity, which range are between 1% and 2% of inequality of the Gini index. And finally, in this regression, in order to obtain our measure of inequality of opportunity, we can see how the most significant circumstances are the mother's height, the type of childbirth, and those variables relate with the family background, like mother's education and the wealth index. And the less significant circumstances are those variables that are related to household facilities. By cohorts, we have similar results, but the circumstances lose significance and the magnitude of the coefficient is smaller due to the smaller sample size. And also we can classify our countries in order of in order to its position in terms of percentiles in the ranking of child health inequality, inequality of opportunity, and its ratio, that is the percentage that the inequality of opportunity represent in child health inequality. Highlights two facts like that there is a weak and positive correlation between health inequality and health inequality of opportunity, but in general, the lowest or the highest level of inequality of opportunity present also the lowest or the highest levels of the EU ratio. At this point, also we try to answer the following question. Is there catch-up within countries? I mean, are the levels of health inequality for the older cohort for the younger cohort being corrected with age, or on the contrary, differences are maintained or even accentuated? Remember that we use 5 cohorts, and notice that also we are not able to analyze properly the catch-up effect because we don't have a longitudinal database and we don't follow the health status of the children over time. The reduce in child health inequality over these cohorts is an indicative of catch-up in health inequality. And the summary of findings are those. First, child health inequality for the older cohort is smaller than health inequality in the younger cohort. So this is an evidence of catch-up. Also, there is a high correlation between health inequality at the younger cohort and health inequality for the older cohort. And the evidences of catch-up in health inequality of opportunities mixed because there are 18 countries which inequality of opportunity decrease, but in 15 countries inequality of opportunity increase. Also, we can see how child health AO ratio has increased with the age distribution in most countries. This evidence means that the child health inequality explained by our set of circumstances is becoming more important as children become older. And finally, in our results, mortality selection bias is not an important concern, and we cannot detect a significant association between this classification of countries and their geography. This table is a summary of the trends of countries in terms of child health inequality, inequality of opportunity, and AO ratio. And finally, we can see which type of circumstances are affecting the existence or not of catch-up in health inequality of opportunity within the countries. To do that, we perform a supply decomposition that this decomposition quantify the contribution of each group of circumstances in order to explain child health inequality of opportunity. And we can see in this table how both for all sample and for each child age cohort, on average, sociodemographic group of circumstances is the most important group explaining child health inequality of opportunity, followed by family background and geography. On the other hand, household structure and household facility are the less important set of circumstances. Also, notice that there are relevant differences in the contribution of these circumstances if we look at each country. And also notice that the contribution of this group of circumstances change with the cohort or with the age of the children. In this sense, we can see how in this graphic family background, household facilities, and geography have an outward contribution trends, and for this reason contribute to explaining this evolution of child health inequality in Sub-Saharan Africa along the age distribution. And finally, the conclusions. We can see how there are evidences of catch-up within country for child height in almost all countries. I mean, health inequality for the older cohort is smaller than the health inequality for the younger cohort. But we have found mixed conclusions regarding catch-up within country for health inequality of opportunity. Also, we can see how the child health inequality explained by our set of circumstances is becoming more important as children become older. Also, we find relevant differences if we look at to each country, but sociodemographic factor is in general followed by family background and geography, the most important set of circumstances in explaining health inequality of opportunity. And finally, the growing contribution of family background, household facilities, and geography contribute to explain this evolution of child health inequality of opportunity in Sub-Saharan Africa along the age distribution. Thank you. It is all.
Okay, let me just give me a second, see if I can get these slides up. Hold on. Be patient with me. There we go. Okay. Okay, so comments on this paper, which I thoroughly enjoyed, really interesting. And I think there's just an enormous contribution simply because of the breadth of the analysis, including 33 countries. And I will say that I personally found the differences across countries, I mean, interesting and also very striking. There were really large differences across countries. I mean, just things that hit me, like the differences in mothers' education, differences in access to water and toilet facilities. Actually, one of the things I found a little concerning was the differences in the importance of the regional. I mean, there were some countries for whom the regional dummies explain pretty close to half of the inequalities. And then the use of the differences across age cohorts as a replacement for unavailable longitudinal data, it's not ideal because you can have confounding time varying factors that you wouldn't catch in this. But I think it is a plausible approach given the available data and a really significant contribution. Okay. So I want to say something about the decomposition of inequality. And here it's less an issue of the methodology, which I think was fine, than perhaps of the terminology and the interpretation. So the approach is modeled on an approach in the existing income inequality literature, which draws a distinction between inequality of opportunity versus inequality of effort, sort of the part of the inequality that isn't the individual's fault and the part of the inequality that is the individual's fault. And I think even for the income inequality literature, the interpretation is questionable. As the authors, I have to say, really do explain, it's that sort of an interpretation of the decomposition is not appropriate for this paper. I mean, there's no way that part of the health inequality is the child's fault. That doesn't make any sense. But they still use the inequality of opportunity label, and I would just suggest thinking about that. It's more a question of how you're communicating about what's going on. And like I said, there's just like a sentence or two early in the paper, and then later in the paper, there's a good solid paragraph saying, clearly, none of this is the kid's fault. You might want to move that up earlier and think about how you want to label it. So, what's accurate, but maybe not very illuminating, is simply explained versus unexplained. There's the stuff that you've got variables that explain it, and then there's the residual that's left over. I think you want to think about, would it be fair to interpret it as systemic versus an idiosyncratic, which seems to be, I guess in some sense, the inequality of opportunity versus other is essentially systemic versus idiosyncratic. So for example, idiosyncratic might include factors such as an individual's exposure to an infectious disease or a physical injury that was something sort of random that happens to individuals. Okay. And obviously the interpretation is important because that is one of, or maybe in fact, the single chief contribution of the paper, that the finding that the explained part of the inequality is more important for the older cohort of children, that the idiosyncratic tends to disappear, well, at least if you're doing a longitudinal interpretation, of the catch-up, that the idiosyncratic part tends to disappear over time. I also think that one of the really interesting findings that you kind of bury in the paper, but I would just suggest putting into the abstract and into your introduction because you ought to highlight it, is the finding that the inequality explains the stunting. So that's not a surprising result. I mean, in some sense, if you think about it, it has to be that way, right? If you had a mean that was, at the average, and there was no inequality, then of course you couldn't have any stunting. I mean, so it just has to be that way. But it's not how the world operates. The world tends to think about means an awful lot, and so I think that's really something to stress. That the fact that there is inequality means that there's stunting. And you do, I mean, you've got it in the paper. I just think you ought to include it earlier and make a bigger deal out of it. Then another question I had, this is really a question because I'm just not sure what the answer is. It's not my field at all. But I'm willing to accept that age-adjusted height is a reasonably good proxy for health. I wonder if catch-up in height is an equally good proxy for catch-up in health. Might it be that you have catch-up in height, but other sorts of health problems persist? And like I said, that's more a question for you than, I really don't know the answer to that one. And then just a couple of smaller issues. Wealth quintiles, I'm kind of assumed that they were defined for the entire sample of 33 countries, but I just wanted to confirm that. I wondered how mother's occupation was defined. You talk about correlation, so in some sense it must be at least ordered, if not a cardinal, at least an ordinal numerical thing. So is it just employed versus not employed? Is it unemployed, part-time, full-time? Just wondered about that. Mother's height correlates with child's height, which you interpret, as I'm sure it is at least partially, as an intergenerational transmission of health. But of course, it's not only about health, right? Some people are just genetically programmed to be taller or shorter, and they will, on average, tend to have taller or shorter kids. And then I just, you know, you include a very full set of regional dummy variables. And in some countries, they're extremely important in explaining the inequality of opportunity or the explained part of the inequality. But of course, they don't really explain anything. And to some extent, that's fine. If you've got unexplained things and they just kind of catch some of those omitted variables, good. But if they're collinear with other explanatory variables, like, for example, household facilities, which I have to say I was kind of surprised how unimportant household facilities like access to clean drinking water or access to toilets seem to be. You know, maybe if you didn't have the regional dummies in there, you'd see the household facilities being more important. Anyway, that's it. I'll stop share.
Okay, Rachel, thank you for your suggestion and for the question. First of all, inequality of opportunity. The idea is practically is inequality that is explained by our variables in the model. That in that sense is the same that if we calculate health inequality in other type of health paper, but we use inequality measure from the economics, like Gini index. Maybe in other papers of health economics, the inequality measure are the concentration index or this type of measure. Second, obviously, catch up in height maybe is not a perfect proxy of catch up in health in child, but like in the literature for child health, the most used measure of child health is child height. For this reason, we use this measure in order to proxy child health. Then, if we permit me. The Wells index is divided in this manner. They have 5 categories in order to differentiate.
Is it for the whole so among the whole 33 country samples, and then you divided the whole?
Yes.
Okay, that was
all the variables that we use are common to all countries, and with the divided categories are the same for all countries.
But you didn't do it within country. See what I'm saying? You put all the 33 countries together and ordered them before dividing them into quintiles, or you did it separately for each country?
No. This index, the Well index, and for example, the mother's occupation, there is a common question in the survey.
I think the question, though, is if an observation is listed as being in the lowest quintile, does that mean the lowest quintile within her country, or the lowest quintile across all SSA?
The lowest quintile in the country.
Oh,
yes.
It is by country.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
All these variables are within country, and we do between country analysis after that.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. And I think we should go on now to Rachel's paper.
I'm so sorry, I'm going to interrupt just really quickly. I just want you guys to know the meeting is going to be open until 3. So I know the session technically ends at 2:30, but we're running the presentations are running a little long, but you guys have until 3. So, you know, at 2:30, the meeting's not gonna just end. You guys have some extra time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I thought that's when the official end of the session was anyway, so I'm glad you're not cutting us off.
Yeah.
We were told. So anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, good.
All right.
Rachel, go.
Let me get my slides up here. There we go. And then I need to do share.
Sorry, what time is it now in the US? Like where you guys are?
1:30.
This is like
Which part of the
1:30, okay,
US? It's 10:30
yeah, no,
in
that's
California.
a good point. Yeah. Okay, fine.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm in New York. For me, it's 1:30.
Okay. I'm in Italy and it's 7:30. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the paper is called Problematic Users, Characteristics of Young Adults at Risk for Smartphone Dependence and Addiction. And I am one of 4 co-authors. And the background here is there's a lot, I mean, there's a huge literature out there on smartphone addiction, internet addiction, tech addiction. And a lot of the focus on smartphones has been in East Asian countries, stuff from Japan, stuff from Taiwan, but in particular from China and South Korea, there's a large literature. And yet in the United States, and there is a literature in the United States, but little is known about the attributes of young adults at risk in the United States, and in particular, little focus on Asians, either Asians born in the United States or Asians born in other countries, you know, Asians born in Asia, Asians, foreign-born Asians in the United States. Okay. One of the things that we have gone as authors back and forth about is, should we even say addiction? Should we say dependent? Should we say problematic use? Should we say excessive use? What do we call this? Because smartphone addiction has not been accepted as a disease by any professional medical association. It's not included in the diagnostic statistical manuals. While for addiction in general, it has been shown that neurobiological alterations and genetic factors play an important role. This has not yet been shown for smartphone use. Also, while for many addictions, excessive use is itself a mark of problematic use, you know, if you think for alcohol, right? If you're drinking a lot of alcohol, that means there's a problem. That's not necessarily true for technology more broadly, but even for smartphones, because heavy use of the technology is often a requirement for success in the workplace. And then finally, you know, just the limit of the data we have, you know, we don't have access to clinical background or formal psychological assessments of our survey respondents. So we're certainly not in a position to diagnose addiction or indeed any sort of mental health problem among our respondents at the individual level. All right, so the research question that we really started out with for this piece of work was, we wanted to explore the demographic characteristics of college students at risk. We wanted to try and identify who was at elevated risk for problematic use of whatever sort of the smartphones, with a special focus on Asians in the United States. It's based on data. I mean, the survey originally was developed with some colleagues in South Korea, and it was actually based on, we collected data from 4 institutions, one of them in South Korea. But for this piece of work, we only used 3 US institutions, and they're all in the Long Island / metropolitan New York area. And 2 of the 3 institutions have significant Asian enrollment. So I think it's 37% across the 3. 37% of the respondents are Asians. A lot of students coming from Queens, for example. So it's a large enough sample size that we can compare results among demographic groups and draw conclusions about differences and similarities, not just between Asians and non-Asians, but between US-born and foreign-born Asian students. And in all cases, Asian is categorized on the basis of the student's self-identification. All right, so the theoretical framework, based on basically the works of 3 people, papers listed here, is that there are we call them behavioral subdomains, 4 of them, that are there's a fairly broad consensus that addictions of various sorts, these 4 subdomains these 4 behavioral tendencies, you could call them, end up placing people at higher risk. Okay, so we're not saying that everybody who scores high in these subdomains is addicted. We're just saying that they place you at higher risk of being subject to addiction or other problematic use problems. Okay, so the 4 subdomains: disturbance of adaptive behavior and virtual life orientation, evidence of withdrawal, symptoms of withdrawal, and evidence of building tolerance. And the next 4 slides will just show you the specific survey questions that we associated with each of these 4 domains. So for adaptive function, it's things like my school grades dropped because I used the phone too much. I have a hard time finishing things. Friends and acquaintances comment that I'm using the phone too much, or family members comment. Family members get angry. When I use my mobile phone, I think I would be more productive if I didn't use it so much. When I use my mobile phone, I think I should be concentrating on study or work instead. And I will say that we had some conversation about whether those last 2 might indicate a person who was conscientious about their studies and conscientious about being productive, and might indicate that you have adaptive function. However, when we did the factor analysis, that's not the way it turned out. They turned out to be strongly positively related to disturbance of adaptive function. Virtual life orientation, basically just saying that you like using your phone better than doing other things. You know, my mobile phone is more enjoyable than spending time with family or friends. My whole personal and social life depends on it, etc. Okay. Withdrawal is symptoms that when you can't use the phone, it's painful. Painful if I couldn't use my phone. I get anxious when I don't have my phone. I panic when I can't use my phone. When I use my phone, I feel bad, but I can't stop using it. So evidence that you're trying to stop and finding it hard, etc. Okay. And then the last one is tolerance. I've tried to reduce use of the phone, but not successfully. It's a habit. I'd be happier if I used my mobile phone less. That somehow the word less got left out of there. And then for tolerance, also here, high levels of use we assumed would be associated. So various categories of high levels of use we assumed would be associated with tolerance. All right, so what do we mean by at risk? We do not hypothesize that every individual who scores high in the 4 subdomains is an addict or a dependent, but we do hypothesize that scoring high in the 4 subdomains indicates that an individual is at elevated risk of problematic mental health consequences associated with smartphone use. All right, so the survey, most of the questions on the survey were drawn from previously validated surveys, in particular, a survey from South Korea. But then we supplemented it with additional demographic questions. For example, the questions about foreign-born versus Asian-born Asian, and with some additional attitudinal questions. Okay. For the attitudinal questions, we use a 5-point Likert scale, with 1 being strongly agree, up to strongly disagree. And then for the frequency of use questions, we use a 7-point Likert scale, with 1 equaling never. Oops, looks like there's a comment here. Chat. Oh, okay. There are sections in the survey with questions on frequency of mobile phone use for different types of use, behavior related to mobile phone use, virtual life orientation, questions on withdrawal, reasons for personal use, feelings and opinions associated with the mobile phone, and demographic information. All right. We had 1,100 approximately potential respondents, and 762 usable responses. So it's a 68% response rate. It was not a random sample. We basically recruited professors who were teaching classes in 2017. We did spring and fall semesters. and asked them, would you let us survey your students? So that was how it was done. In both cases, towards the end of the semester, when people were thinking about grades, and there was most of the professors agreed to offer small amounts of extra credit to students who completed it. So we did make an effort as we were recruiting the professors to make sure that we had a wide variety of courses. It included introductory freshman courses, senior courses, courses that were required courses, and courses that were electives, only for the majors in that particular field, graduate courses up to the master's level, I should say, and undergraduate courses, and disciplines, variety in the arts and sciences, people from the business school, and people from the health sciences. So ultimately we actually asked students to list their majors, students coming from 40 different majors. Okay? And it was a fairly long survey, so we had a rich set of controls to use in the statistical analysis. All right, so the analytical strategy, we did a confirmatory principal components analysis to construct 4 indices, each one associated with the 4 behavioral subdomains described above. And so it's confirmatory, meaning that we assigned the questions to the subdomains on the basis of theory. And then we took each of those indices, so each individual has a score on each of the indexes, each of those indices, and used it as the dependent variable in an OLS regression that allowed us to explore demographic characteristics associated with each of the index. And then finally, we wanted some kind of simple way to talk about what was going on. So we constructed a binary indicator based on the 4 indexes, and we simply, the one that I'm reporting here, we simply gave equal weight to each of the 4 indexes, and then the binary indicator was 1 if the people were above the 75th percentile. So basically you had 1 for 25% of the population and 0 for the other 3/4. Okay. This is admittedly a very ad hoc approach. As I said, I'm going to report the results for the one where we placed equal weight on each of the indices, but we did do some supplementary analyses using different weighting schemes for the 4 indices, and the qualitative conclusions, you get some differences in the specific numbers, but odds ratios, but the qualitative conclusions were robust to other weighting schemes. Okay. All right. So selected descriptive statistics, and what I've done here is divided them into foreign-born Asian, US-born Asian, and non-Asian. And this is just what the calculated indices were for each of the 4 subdomains. And you see some differences here. In general, they're highest for Asians who were born in Asia, except for tolerance, okay, where they're highest for Asians who were born in non-Asian countries, and clearly lowest, lowest and actually negative for non-Asian. Education, some moderate differences. The GPA was slightly higher for non-Asians. It's possible that if we controlled for the school, that would go away. Actually, that's one of the things I think we need to go back and do. Mother's years of schooling were somewhat higher for the non-Asians. Father's year of schooling were highest for Asians who were born in Asia. And then graduate education for either father or mother was higher for the Asians than for the non-Asians. Non-Asians were more likely to have a significant other, meaning a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Asians who were born in Asia were more likely to say that their income was above average income. I will say one of the weaknesses, we don't have numerical values for income. People were simply asked to self-categorize as, my family's income is above average, my family's income is average, my family's income is below average. Okay. And non-Asians were more likely to be working. All right, so I basically just pulled out the significant results from the OLS regressions. If you look at the paper, you can see the complete set of control variables that were included. Okay. So being female was associated with being more likely to score high on 3 of the 4 subdomains. Being an Asian-born one, again, more likely to score high on 3 of the 4, not tolerance, interestingly, so different ones. Females were not oriented to the virtual life didn't come out for the females. I included Kuhn, that's having a major in the humanities, because that turned out to be strongly negatively associated with the adaptive, problems with adaptive function. Having above average income or average income was protective, particularly significantly with the virtual life one, although protective for the others as well, but not statistically significant. And then for the logistic regression, Asians who were born in Asia were more than twice as likely. So this is with that binary indicator of being at risk with the equally weighted, the 4 subdomains equally weighted. Asians born in Asia more than twice as likely to be above the 75th percentile for that at-risk index, and highly statistically significant, at the p less than 1% level. Asians born in the US almost twice as likely, and females about 1.5 times as likely. We also saw that respondents in a relationship, this was not something we were looking for, but it's something that turned out, were about 1.5 times as likely. We hypothesize that might be because the smartphones are so important for keeping touch with a significant other. Okay. Above average income, the odds ratio was slightly below 1, but not significantly different from 1. So that effect that we saw with above average income being protective didn't come through in this measure with all the, that we saw in the descriptive statistics didn't come through. And that is actually it. Stop there.
Okay, thank you. So while I'm getting my screen sharing set up, there was a question. So Rachel, can you maybe elaborate on what the virtual life orientation is measuring?
Sure. So let me go back and show you that slide again, but it's basically saying that the stuff happening in your virtual life is more important to you. So that it's the respondents saying their virtual life was more important to them than other things. So I can bring up the slide to again. Whoops, well, I won't because James is, but that it was I'd rather question. Be on my team than with family. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I just have a couple comments here. Put into PowerPoint mainly because it was fun finding clip art for smartphone addicted people. So let me just jump right in. So many strengths of the paper, of course. I think this is a very interesting study of smartphone dependence, disorder, addiction, whatever you want to call it. I think you're probably right. Don't use the word addiction if you're going for an actual medical or public health audience, but I mean, economists, we'd be fine with it, but dependence is probably a good word too, or at risk, I like that. It's nice that you're grounded in at least what psychologists call theory. These 4 things that are measurable, which is good. This disturbance measure, the virtual life oriented, withdrawal, something we can probably all relate to, and tolerance. And of course, there are interesting results that she just presented. I think the differences between the genders and between the Asians and where they were born are particularly interesting. And I could talk a lot more about the strengths, but I wanted to try to give you some suggestions, kind of in the take it or leave it vein. So my suggestions basically just have to do with how you present your findings so that people don't get confused. So I think you will be well served if you admit right up front that everything in your study is descriptive. You have no experiments. You have you actually don't even have any variables that are manipulable. And so you can't really talk about causality. And we do this all the time as econometricians. I'm bad about it too, but sometimes you slip into some causal language that I don't think should be there. Like you can't talk about omitted variable bias, but I mean, what's being biased? You're just picking up correlations. They are what they are. You use the phrase causal variability, which I wouldn't. You can't talk about something like race or gender as causing anything the way social scientists think about causality, because those are, well, less true than it used to be, but at least traditionally not manipulable by the experimenter. So I would just be a little protective of the language that you use so that people are clear. I would suggest thinking about not using the logit at the end, and this is not a comment at all about the weighting scheme. I'm happy with equal weighting, and I'm happy that you tried other weighting. But after weighting, you still have a range of numbers. Okay, so there's a minimum number and a maximum number, and I assume that that's why you are kind of reducing it down to a logit, but you're still throwing away information, I would say, and why do it? You could do fractional logit, and there are some very nice results that Wooldridge has pointed out in recent years about the robustness of that procedure, but it will help keep all the discriminatory power in your index along its full allowable range. And so that's something that you might want to consider. And it's not hard to do if you use Stata, for example, won't be hard at all. Okay, now here's something, since I started teaching a class on survey data to our students at Pepperdine and got into the non-econometric literature where they use odds ratios all the time, I realized that most econometricians don't really understand them. And so I just want you to protect yourself against people misunderstanding what you're saying. Econometricians, we always think in terms of marginal effects, but that's not what odds are. Odds are not probabilities, right? And so if an odds ratio is 1.9, you can't say that something is 90% more likely to an econometrician, because they will think that that means in terms of probabilities, the ratio is 1.9. Okay, and with odds, depending on what the baseline probabilities are, that can lead people to really misunderstand what is actually going on. So I just say, write in such a way to protect those of us who in grad school never heard the words odds ratio or odds from misunderstanding what you've done. Here's a real minor point. Asian born in Asia, of course, you have to make a decision as to what the age cutoff is. I just wondered about, is 5 years really the right number? Because I think if I emigrated away from my country at age 6, I probably would think of myself as American. But, so if you have many people falling into the 5 to 10 year bin, maybe just run it both ways to see if anything changes. And then finally, I was confused about this during the paper, and I got confused again during your presentation, because you use the word factor analysis, but you don't say that you actually do factor analysis. You say that you do principal components analysis. So this slide might be completely wrong, and if so, forgive me. But you almost seem to treat those as synonyms, but they're not. So for example, there's no such thing as confirmatory PCA. There is confirmatory factor analysis, but that's something different. Now maybe that's what you did, and it's just how you wrote it up. So I apologize. But just remember, PCA is just purely descriptive. It's just an arbitrary way. It's in the answer to the question, nothing more, nothing less. What is an index that preserves the maximal variation in these set of variables if we reduce the dimension down to 1? Okay, that's it. Has no meaning. You can't talk about, it's not confirming anything. And that's not what you meant anyway, I know, but just stay away from that, because if someone Googles confirmatory PCA, which I did just to check my understanding, it doesn't exist. Now, if you want to take latent factors seriously in the analysis, there are ways to do that, of course. You could do true factor analysis. You could do structural equation modeling. You could do multiple indicator, multiple cause analysis, mimic. And these are not hard to do, again, in Stata nowadays. But and so maybe it's just a matter of writing up what you did and not changing what you did. But I found myself a little confused at that part. And that's it. Okay, so we have some time here, so you can either respond or others can jump in with questions.
I mean, actually, one response is, can you please make sure I get a copy of the slides?
Of course.
Slides, that would be very helpful. Let's see, there were a couple of things I wanted to mention. I think the idea of not collapsing it to a binary is a good idea. And that's definitely something to explore. In terms, it was principal components analysis. It was confirmatory in the sense that so maybe confirmatory is not the right word, but we put structure on it by assigning questions to the 4 subdomains.
Yeah, I'm just cautioning you, since confirmatory factor analysis means something very specific in the literature, and you're not doing that.
Okay. Yeah, no, you're right. That's really something. And in fact,
use the word theory guided or theoretically guided.
That's a good suggestion. I have to think about the issue of causality and in particular omitted variable. I mean, clearly, so you're saying it's not a causal.
I'd say if you're not estimating a treatment effect, the coefficients are what they are. They're purely descriptive. I mean, they can be interpreted as partial correlation coefficients, but that's it. I mean, race doesn't cause anything. Gender doesn't cause anything. It can be highly associated with certain things, but just by the technical definition of causality, if you can't manipulate it to a social scientist, it's not.
Well, it's certainly not. I mean, it's not an experiment, but you don't think it's possible that as a result of your gender, things happen, like, you know,
but that's not,
there's a very strong correlation between being
but that's not causality as defined.
Okay.
Just there's a literature there. Take a look at it, and you can feel free to reject my view of it.
Okay. Okay. Although, I mean, so take that example, right? Mm-hmm. Having kids, being female, and you don't include the age, right? You'll get a different correlation than if you do include the age. So I don't know what language
highly associated
about that. Not omitted variable bias. What language do you use to talk about that if you don't say omitted variable bias?
I don't know. We should probably continue this.
All right. That's okay. I appreciate it. Those are a lot of. There's a lot of room for thought there, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question for Rachel? Okay, I believe Amit's presentation is next, which will be discussed then by Nicole.
Okay, so can everyone see my screen and hear me as well?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so this is my first COVID paper, or at least pandemic paper, that I took a stab at with my co-author Hamid Baladi. Now, before I say anything else, let me tell you folks that this is a theoretical paper, so there's a lot of mathematics in the paper, which I'm not sure whether my discussant was enthused or not by the amount of mathematics, but at least today, I'm going to tell you folks a story and largely de-emphasize the mathematics. You're more than welcome to read the paper if you want to see all the mathematics and its rationale in gory detail. Okie dokie, let's get started. So when you look at a pandemic in general, and you look at certainly COVID-19, one of the things that's pretty clear to everybody is that the regional impacts of this pandemic have been very different. Not only at a point in time, but also over time. Within the United States, for instance, in the Northeast, some states such as my own, New York, were doing pretty well early in the pandemic. Then they did not so well, and now they're doing again pretty well, at least as measured by vaccinations. If you look at a region as a country, then generally speaking, even though China was walloped first in Wuhan, countries like Taiwan, New Zealand, even Australia are doing a much better job of handling the pandemic than many other countries in Western Europe, certainly the United Kingdom and US. But again, there too, there are improvements now. So the general point is that there are regional differences in the occurrence of and the management of a pandemic such as COVID. COVID-19. Now, a literature review suggests the following conclusion, and this is what we're claiming in this paper, is that at best as we can tell, there are 0 theoretical studies in the regional science literature and more generally in the economics literature that look at 3 things. 1, how does the impact of a pandemic influence the welfare of a poor region? And I'll say more about a poor region in a couple minutes. And how do policies that are formulated by this, say, for instance, regional authority, affect this region's welfare and, in particular, this region's resilience? Now, more on resilience in a couple of minutes. So what we do in this particular paper, given this lacuna in the literature, is to explicitly construct and analyze a model of an economically disadvantaged region that looks at the links between health interventions on the one hand, the impact of these interventions on a poor region's welfare, and ultimately this region's resilience in the presence of a pandemic. Now, the pandemic could be general, but of course, I'm thinking about COVID-19, given that's what we're currently living in the middle of. Okay, so here we go to a theoretical framework. So think about a poor region, by which I mean an economically disadvantaged region. So for example, if people are thinking about a region as a state, Chhattisgarh is a poor state in India, Mississippi is a poor state in the United States. So I have something like this in mind, but of course the region does not have to be a state. It could even be a sub-state geographical area, such as either a county or a city, or for that matter, a district. Now, the point is, no matter what kind of region we look at, generally all regions compile health indicators which tell observers what the health status of residents in their particular region is like. So focusing on my own home state, that is New York, we have the so-called New York State Community Health Indicator Reports, the so-called CHIRS. And what this particular indicator reports do is make up a dashboard that tracks 350 indicators that are organized by 15 different health topics. So one can really obtain a lot of information about, for instance, the incidence of cancer, cardiovascular diseases, and more generally communicable diseases. Now, since we are interested in the health effects of a pandemic such as COVID-19, we're also going to focus on a health indicator, H, in the paper. And this health indicator will tell us the proportion of the region's population that does not, repeat, not have any respiratory diseases of any kind. Okay, so that's the health indicator that we focus on. And we assume that in the absence of a shock such as a pandemic, that this health indicator has a long-run stable, steady state value. Call it H0. Okay. Okay, now enter the pandemic. Now, the pandemic's arrival is clearly stochastic or probabilistic. So when the pandemic arrives and hits this particular region, what it does is lower the value of this health indicator to some number below its long-run steady state value, H0. So what that means is when H0 goes down, the proportion of the regional population that now has one or more respiratory ailments goes up. Okay. Now, to combat this insidious effect of the pandemic, the regional authority takes some action. Now, in general, this action could be a vector or a scalar. In our paper, it's a scalar, but we could think of it as a vector. And the objective of taking this action is to raise the value of the health indicator from H0 to some better level, such as H0 plus beta times A, where beta is just a positive parameter and A is the action. So your objective is to take action to improve the value of the health indicator. And taking this action, of course, is not costless. So we assume that the cost of taking the action is described by a standard, strictly increasing, strictly convex cost function, that's C of A. So what might be some of these actions? It's something that you folks have all heard of. It could be lockdowns, mandatory mask wearing, increased testing, quarantining visitors, and those testing positive for COVID-19, all of these things. So these are the kinds of examples of actions that I have in mind when I say that the regional authority takes action to control the insidious effects of this pandemic. Okay, so that said, the first task is to provide some link between a regional authority's action and the health indicator H. Now, To model this effect, think of any time t, and at this time t, let ZT or ZT outside the United States, ZT measure the deviations in the value of this health indicator from its long-run steady state value when action A has been taken by the regional authority to deal with this particular pandemic. So ZT denotes the deviation in the value of this health indicator. Now, clearly, because the occurrence of the pandemic is stochastic, these deviations are themselves stochastic. So the next modeling question that we confront is, how do we model these deviations? There are two things to keep in mind. One, the Z's themselves are stochastic and they're changing over time. In other words, ZT is a stochastic process. So we have to have some way of describing the stochastic process if we want to make further progress. So some thought suggests to us that we expect these deviations, even though they're stochastic over time. If the regulator or regional authority is doing a good job, we expect these ZTs to demonstrate some kind of mean reversion. Now, this is our guess. We don't have any data to suggest that this is in fact the case. In fact, I don't think anybody's modeled the underlying problem in this way. So we don't have any foolproof information that this is the case. But it seems reasonable to us to suppose that this ZT or deviation random variable, which constitutes a stochastic process over time, should be described as a mean reverting process. So that said, the simplest mean reverting process that we can think about is the well-known Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process. So we suppose that ZT, in fact, follows an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, which tangibly means this stochastic differential equation. So this is the left-hand side describing the evolution of the deviations over time. This is the deterministic component, and this is the stochastic component. So sigma is a variance parameter, and dW is the increment of a standard Wiener process, sometimes also called Brownian motion. Okay. So having described these deviations as following an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, then thankfully, even though it's a pain in the neck, we can solve for the steady state probability distribution function of ZT, and that's given by this particular expression, equation 2. Okay, so now we have a way of characterizing these deviations that occur over time. Okay, so what should our regional authority be thinking about in terms of how to handle the so-called health indicator taking action A? So we suppose that in this particular paper, it's reasonable for our regional authority to focus on some minimally acceptable value of the health indicator when you are fighting the ill effects of this pandemic COVID-19. Okay, so what should the minimum value be? Well, we'll come to specific examples when we focus on applications later, but we suppose that the minimal value of the health indicator is H sub m. That means in English, the objective of the regional authority is to take action A so that the proportion of people in this poor region with no respiratory ailments of any kind does not fall below this threshold. So the threshold could be 0.7, it could be 0.8, it could be anything. So if it's 0.7, then you want to make sure that at least 70% of the people in this particular population are not adversely impacted by this pandemic. And of course, the numbers of HM will change, and we ourselves use a specific number. Okay, so given that the goal is to take action to focus on this particular minimally acceptable threshold of the health indicator, what we want to do next, since everything is happening in a stochastic environment, is to compute the likelihood that the health status of this particular region's population will in fact stay above, or if you like below, because one is just one minus the other, because it's the probability, so will stay above the minimum acceptable level H sub m, given that you're intervening by taking action A. So we want to compute this particular probability. Now, again, after several algebraic steps, details are in the paper, the probability is given by this particular equation. Okay. So what does this equation tell us? Well, it gives us a probability density function. Moreover, it provides us with an explicit way of computing the density of these deviations once the regional authority takes action A to hopefully improve the value of the health indicator far above its long-run steady state value of H naught. Okay. All right, now we come to the optimization problem. So given that we can have an explicit probability density function to describe how these deviations behave when there is action A being taken by the regional authority, we can state this regional authority's optimization problem. What does this individual do? Well, this individual maximizes the likelihood that the health status of the region's population will stay above the minimum acceptable level H sub m at economic cost C of A. That's the objective function. So here is the objective function. You want to maximize the probability that the health of this particular region's population will be above H sub m at economic cost C of A. Now, I hope you'll recognize that this is a non-traditional objective function because you can think of this first part as a public health objective and this second part as an economic objective. So this is really a mixed objective function that is part public health and part economic in terms of the costs. Now we can rewrite this particular function, and I'm not going to get into the details, but you can differentiate this particular, let me go back. You can differentiate this particular equation with respect to A, set the value of the derivative equal to 0 as we standardly do. So this is the first order necessary condition for an optimum. This is the second order sufficiency condition. Let's interpret this in plain English. So the right-hand side is easy to interpret. So this is just the marginal cost of taking action A. So the idea is you should be taking an action, whatever it might be, such that the marginal cost of this action is equal to the marginal likelihood that the regional's population's health status will in fact be above the level that you've determined to be the minimally acceptable level of the health indicator. Okay. All right. So given that this optimization problem has been formulated and I've described, at least in full generality thus far, the first order necessary condition and its English meaning, let's try to connect this particular finding to something that I said a couple minutes ago, the resilience of this particular region when this action is being taken by the regional authority to improve the health status of this region's population. Okay, so the problem is without doing some numerical analysis, it's impossible to proceed any further at this level of generality. So suppose A star is the closed form expression of, for this particular first order necessary condition. So what I'm saying is suppose A star is the solution to this differential equation. Now this is a mess, but we know that a solution exists. So A star, let that be that particular solution. So now I'm going to have to work with specific numerical values.
Did he freeze for everyone else too? Okay.
Yeah, he seems to have frozen. Can everybody
He's
else?
frozen for all of us, it appears.
Yeah.
Something's wrong for him.
Oh, there he is.
Yeah, but I think I lost my, let me go back to breakout room 2.
Okay, well, you're here though.
Yeah, this.
Okay.
We see you.
But no one can see.
We lost the screen share, but we can see you and hear you.
Okay, let me try to screen share. Let me get out of this and try to screen share again and let us see what happens.
Yeah, and just so you know, you have 4 minutes yet.
Okay. Share screen. Now it's not letting me share my screen. Okay, let me.
If you want, of course, you can always just talk your way through the rest of the presentation.
Return to meeting. Okay. Do not despair, at least not yet. Now. Can people see my screen now? No? What about now?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to have to speed up. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay, so here we are. So we have some numerical analysis to do to show the demonstration of this particular model that I'm working with. So I'm going to work on two applications, but I may not get time to go to the second one. So in the first application, the region is more healthy because the value of this health indicator is 0.6. That means this is the number of people who do not have any respiratory ailments. That's 60% of the population. And in the second application, it's a less healthy population, more healthy population, because only 50% do not have any respiratory ailments. Okay, and I suppose that H sub m, that is the value of the minimum acceptable threshold, is 0.8. So it's set pretty high, but of course we can get similar results for alternate numbers. And finally, the cost function is the exponential cost function. So when we use all of these numerical values and the functional form that I just described, that is the exponential cost function, the first order necessary condition turns out to be a quadratic equation. It's a mess, but still at least workable. So we know how to solve quadratic equations. There are two values or two roots that solve this quadratic equation. And in our case, of these two roots, this particular value maximizes the RA's objective function. So this is the value of the action. And the way to interpret this particular number is the maximum level at which you can operate a particular action, such as contact tracing, is 100%. So this tells us the fraction or the percent of that maximum effort that you should be applying, depending on what underlying action that you're taking. So now let's explore the connection between our regional authorities' maximization problem and resilience. So what is resilience? So the resilience of a socioeconomic system is the capacity of the system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. So this is resilience in the sense of Buzz Halling, those of you who are familiar with this particular term. So the question we can ask is, when will our poor region be able to withstand the pandemic-induced disturbance and still retain its function, structure, identity, and feedbacks? And the answer we propose in our paper is that when, as a result of the regional authorities' action, the health status of this population is above the minimum acceptable threshold H sub m. So we can calculate for both applications what is the probability that the RA's action will in fact improve the regional population's health status to at least 0.8. And in the first application, the answer turns out to be 0.52 or 52%. So there's a 52% chance that the RA will succeed in getting to at least health level 0.8 when he or she takes action A. So how do we interpret this? Well, one thing to say is clearly interpreted probabilistically. Well, there's a 52% chance that when action A is taken, the health status of the population will be above this threshold H. What we propose in this particular paper is, why not think about this probabilistic outcome as the region's resilience? So when action A is taken and this results in the population's health status being above 0.8, we can say that not only is the likelihood of success 52%, we can also say that the probability that this region is resilient in the sense of Buzz Halling is also 52%. So when interpreted this way, resilience becomes a probability which you can explicitly bound above by 1 and below by 0. So we do the same thing in the second application. I don't have time to go through all the details, but in this case, the probability of success becomes a little lower, 0.46 or 46% of the time, the RA is going to be successful in bringing the health status of the population above 0.8, that's H sub m. So when we do this particular analogy, one check that we go through is the intuitive check. In other words, when confronted with two different populations, one more healthy and the other less healthy, it should be easier for the regional authority to improve the health status of the population to this desired threshold for the healthier population. Now, in a stochastic setting, being successful, of course, can only be meaningfully gauged in terms of probabilities. So is it the case that when we adopt this particular approach of the paper, the RA is more successful for the more healthy population? Well, that's exactly what does happen in our paper, because for the more healthy population, the probability of success is 52%, which is clearly larger than the probability of success for the less healthy population. So I'm skipping a lot of details, but let me summarize what we do in this particular paper. The first point is, as best as we can tell, this is the first paper that explicitly provides a stochastic modeling of the COVID-19 phenomenon in which three things are tied together. One, the onset of the pandemic. Two, health actions taken by a regional authority to improve the health status of the population. And three, connecting these two things to the idea of resilience. So we showed how an RA's health intervention stochastically impacted the health indicator, then computed the probability that the health status of this region's population would be above this minimum, whatever the minimum might be, 0.7, 0.8, whatever. Then we solved an explicit optimization problem in which the RA tried to maximize the likelihood that the health status would be above this minimum acceptable threshold at a particular given cost, and then discuss the connections between the health status and this region's resilience. Now, many extensions are possible. One extension would be to make H sub m, that is the minimum acceptable threshold itself, endogenous and not exogenous as it currently is in the paper. And second would be to study a scenario where it's not possible or possible only at great cost for our regional authority to reverse the adverse impacts of respiratory ailments. In other words, when respiratory ailments exhibit hysteresis, how do you deal with hysteresis problem? That would be another way to extend the analysis in this paper. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
My turn. Can everyone see my screen? May I do so?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. So first, yes, thank you for your presentation. Indeed, I'm not a theorist. I definitely enjoyed it though, and I thought for a theory paper, it was intuitive and very well understandable, if you can phrase it in that way. Like, it definitely made sense what you meant, how you set everything up, and especially what I really like is I did some work on the COVID data side, and I saw some theory papers, and this is definitely one of the first ones that I saw that linked this health intervention to various outcomes in different regions. So I thought it was really nice. First things first, yeah, of course, you just mentioned this. The objective was to determine resilience of a region. Is an indicator of the likelihood of successful implementation of the health intervention of the regional authority. If I got this correctly, of course, please correct me if I got something wrong. And the general finding was it's harder for the authority to improve the health status of a poor region above this desired threshold if the region is less healthy. Vice versa, if it's a healthier region. And this is the model, of course, that you just discussed, that you how this is determined and implemented. And I thought one of the strengths definitely was how applicable it is to many different areas. I think you mentioned this in the introduction of the paper as well. Natural disasters, pandemics, of course, COVID. I was actually thinking that it might be possible to extend this to various other areas as well. Maybe humanitarian aid would be interesting. And for a second, I even thought about like more fiscal and monetary policies. Of course, you step away from health indicators, but it would still be a way to use this model to see transmissions of policy through a certain structure resilience of a region. Yeah, that was that part. You didn't touch as much upon resilience in the presentation as in the paper, and I thought this was actually one of the most interesting aspects. I was also a little bit confused. This was probably me, but I wanted to put this out there and ask you what this one. So this is your definition of resilience that you're using, the capacity of the system to absorb the disturbance and reorganize while undergoing the change to retain the same function, structure, identity, feedback. And as I got it from the paper, the idea is that the resilience sort of indicates the capability of the system to return to its initial state through the health interventions of the authority. And then, of course, the resilience is the probability that the authority's health intervention will be successful. So you will achieve this minimum acceptable level, this HM. Is that, I assume that that's got you correctly. I started thinking, and I was actually wondering if resilience is not a predetermined characteristic sort of a specific region, like the region has a certain level of resilience, and that resilience, the purpose of the health intervention is to absorb disturbance, sort of deviations from the certain state that the region is not capable by absorbing by itself, like by its initial resilience. And I just wondered if then the health intervention affects the resilience in that way, or the resilience affects the substrate of the health intervention. And to me, maybe I'm not thinking about this in the right way, but to me, I sort of got stuck also in the paper by thinking about the combination of resilience linked to the success rate of an intervention of an authority, and how I would really merge these two ideas together. For me, it was a little difficult in some ways to think about it. I did think it got clearer during your presentation, so maybe I just need more time to dwell on it, but this was something that that I found a bit confusing. Some very last comments in general. Linked to COVID-19, you also mentioned here in the beginning that certain areas that were initially heavily affected by COVID now do better. I wondered how exactly this could be linked to the model. Of course, you can take some data and see this area was wealthy and they implemented X, Y, Z, and therefore it's doing better. But I don't think across the board it's the case that all better or like wealthier or poorer regions do better or worse, depending on the interventions, of course. But I think this would be a way too specific, probably way of thinking of a general model. So I assume you don't have the data for this, and therefore it makes sense you didn't do this. But I thought it would actually be interesting to get the data, because I think it would be possible and see how, to what extent this would hold. I thought of resilience as an indicator of how long it takes for a system to return to its initial state. So what like actually time dimension is that resilience could maybe play a role in as well. Like, could you be very resilient, but only over time, very resilient in a shorter period of time? Also, again, I answered this is not necessarily a theoretical consideration that I'm making here, but I just started thinking from my point of view. And thinking of COVID, I think one of the nice applications that might be easy to do for maybe more empirical extensions, not that I think the paper needs that, but just the general interesting potential application of the model will be to use the model as a measure of impact of health policies, where you would consider H0 as the percentage, for example, vaccinated people, and how the remaining interventions that could be scheduled could be done by regional authorities can still have an impact in driving down the infection rate further, for example. And those were the comments I had.
Okay, thank you. I think to give you your full half hour, let's just go ahead and start your presentation, Nicole, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end, and then maybe Amit can respond.
Okay.
Yes.
In the meantime, I'll just say, Amit, you get extra points for making me think about Brownian bridges, which I haven't had to do since grad school.
I think it's a benefit that I'm still doing my PhD, and I still remember the discussions we had on Brownian motion. So it was still there, like somewhere. I was like, oh yeah, wait, I heard about this. Okay, so my turn, last but not least, I hope. So I'm going to be presenting my paper, which is called Living in the Caliphate, the Impact of Exposure to Boko Haram's Ideology on School Attendance. I'm from the European University Institute, and I'm still in my PhD. And this is my most developed paper so far. So as the title sort of gives away, we're going to be looking at what the effect is of Boko Haram's very anti-educational ideology on school attendance rates in Northeast in Nigeria. Why is this interesting? Well, the majority of the literature, as far as I know, really focuses on the effects of exposure to conflict, to direct violence during civil war, wars in general, insurgencies, on these microeconomic outcomes. However, they normally omit the potential effect of being exposed to certain ideology during conflict in measuring these outcomes. An example is that many papers look at the number of fatalities in the vicinity of the household, or if the house itself or dwelling that people lived in was damaged during the war. This is then used as an indicator for having experienced conflict. And this is, for example, taken as, does this affect school attendance? What I'm going to be arguing here is that because we know that exposure to ideology affects attitudes, affects beliefs, and thereby in turn affects behavior, it is very likely that effects that we pick up are actually partially also due to ideological exposure. So your behaviors are affected by the ideas you're exposed to. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be isolating the effect of exposure to ideology from the exposure or effect of violence, exposure to violence directly. The specific research question is, what is the effect of exposure to Boko Haram's anti-educational ideology on school attendance among children in Northeast Nigeria? As a brief summary of what we're going to do, we're going to be focusing on 2009 to 2019. Only school-aged children in North Nigeria are going to be in our sample. As an identification strategy, we're going to be using the fact that Boko Haram occupied specific territories in 2014, 2015. And these people were highly exposed to Boko Haram's ideology. And we're going to be estimating this effect of exposure to ideology with a difference in different subdivisions. Very brief background, so we have an idea on what we're looking at. In general, 9 years of education are mandatory and free in Nigeria since 2004. These 9 years consist of 6 years of primary school and 3 years of junior secondary school. And children are roughly 6 to 14 years old when they go through this mandatory part of education. And Boko Haram, most of you probably have heard of it. It's a terrorist organization, officially now since 2014 or something, designated as a terrorist organization. And their name, very loosely translated, means something like Western education is forbidden. However, Boko Haram is not only against schooling and education in that sense, but they reject all secular aspects of Nigerian society, and especially all Western influences on society. And that's also related to what they mean when they say education is forbidden. It's sort of the learning of a specific society of different inputs and other ideas. So it's not schooling, it's a whole bunch of things, which I will get back to later on. The purpose of Boko Haram is to overthrow the Nigerian government and establish an Islamic state. And they actually occupied various territories from mid-2014 to mid-2015, and they proclaimed this Islamic state in these territories during that point of time. The data we're going to be using is a mixture of the Nigeria General Household Survey, panel data survey. We're going to be using individual level data from this. We have violence data from the Armed Conflict and Location Event data, ACLED, which many people might know. And we're going to be supplementing this with Universal Basic Education Commission data, which is data on the number of schools, number of teachers, and so forth in every single local government area in Nigeria. And we have a pretty small sample, but still it's 3,348 observations for 2009-2019. And this consists of only those children of school-going age that lived in very specific states in Northeast Nigeria. The identification is, of course, the main thing of this paper. And I'm going to be assuming that those who lived in Boko Haram's caliphate are considered to be highly exposed to the group's ideology compared to those who lived in the government control area. We know that Boko Haram tried to wipe out all Western influences on society in the areas it controlled, and they converted the population and enforced their ideas on them extensively. There are a lot of interviews done by Amnesty International with people who lived in these areas, and therefore we have a pretty clear view of what actually happened. So they enforced a very strict set of rules that affected all aspects of day-to-day life. They actually established a court that enforced these rules. They completely prohibited Western education, and importantly, for our attrition rates, they prohibited to travel from one village to the other, or even leave the caliphate altogether. Using this division, so people who lived in these areas and did not live in these areas, we end up with a treatment group of about 340 observations and almost 3,000 in our control group. This is a very balanced panel. They're almost identical in terms of like age, gender, rural, if the father works in households, in agriculture, and so forth. We have a very low attrition rate, which is not that logical if you think of civil war and like a treatment group and people and terrorist organizations occupy your areas. However, as I said, Boko Haram forbade people leaving the area. And the survey design was changed fundamentally right after 2015, and they dropped specific areas from the whole survey design, which of course we did then too. And those people might have been most likely to drop out of our survey. So, but those are not included by default. So eventually we only have about 2% attrition, which is a very good thing. And the trends of school attendance between the two groups prior to treatment are almost identical. Big thing is, of course, potential threats to the identification of this effect, because the main thing will be, of course, the idea that violence is going to be driving the effect that we're going to be picking up and not actually exposure to ideology. This will be the case if the treatment group was exposed to, for example, much higher levels of violence than my control group, simply because they live in an occupied area. I measure this in various different ways. So because we have the exact GPS location of anonymized GPS location of the household in our survey data, as well as the exact location of all violent events in Aklet, we can match these and see if there were any violent events in 5 or 10 kilometer radius of the household due to Boko Haram. I do this for fatalities, any non-fatal Boko Haram events, and any general other events. And the levels of violence prior to my treatment, during the treatment period, and after the treatment are almost identical for both my treatment and control group. And because, of course, this spread can be larger than just 10 kilometers, like if something happens still in your region, you might still be affected by this. Checking for this as well, I look at the entire government area, and violence is also there, almost identical. Finally, we could maybe omit certain things, or it could be a specific bias in the communities that were occupied and the ones that were not occupied. However, from the data that we have from the survey, again, where people are asked, are there banks in your village? Is there a school? Is there a police station? How far is this? How far is that? We can look into what the general level of development is of villages, and they are, again, almost the same between our treatment and control group. And interestingly, our treatment group is even sometimes a little bit higher developed in the sense that there are more healthcare centers and more schools. Having touched upon all of that, we're going to be estimating a pretty straightforward difference in difference estimation. We have school attendance, which is just a dummy. We include individual effects, time fixed effects, of course, the treatment dummy here, and a bunch of control variables. This will be our main result, which indicates that being exposed to ideology of Boko Haram for about a year and a half leads to a 22%, leads to being 22% less likely to attend school in the years after the occupation. And this result is robust for inclusion of any kind of violent exposure, these controls, or the fixed effects, and also leaving the fixed effects out. Of course, it could be the idea that this effectively found is driven by completely different things, that we're just picking up the fact that maybe children work more at home after occupation because household income dropped during civil war. Children could also be of worse health, or there simply could not be any schools to go to after the occupation and civil war period. However, we find no evidence of this happening whatsoever. When I look at child labor, two different proxies for child labor, if kids work outside the household, on the household farm, or for the household, we don't find any effects here. Health status, we also don't find any real effect. It would be like a 3% less chance that kids are ill or injured in my treatment group, but that's so incredibly small that I think it's negligible. And moreover, from the surveys that we have, we don't find any indication that there would be less primary schools in communities that were previously occupied. If any, there are more primary schools in those areas. We also find this from the government data that we have on school presence, that in those areas, there are actually more primary schools and more junior secondary schools. This indicates that the effectively found that 22% reduction cannot really be due to either child health, child labor, or the presence of schools. If it's really true that we're estimating the effect of the exposure to Boko Haram's ideology here, it would make sense that we can find a similar effect for these outcomes. For example, we can look at the usage of healthcare and women's employment. We know that Boko Haram is pretty anti-Western healthcare and Western medicine in many ways. For example, they have a tremendous, very negative impact on the polio vaccination campaign in Nigeria. And with respect to women's employment, they have very clear ideas, and also enforce these ideas in the occupied areas, that women should mainly stay at home and not seek external employment, so not work outside of the house. For looking at healthcare, because of course, if we're going to find an effect here, it would indicate that we're actually picking up this ideology effect. We're just going to extend the sample to include all ages. As a proxy for the usage of this healthcare, we look if people have purchased medicine in the past 12 months or have gotten medicine for free, because there are a lot of health centers where you can also just go and pick up a medicine for free. As just a general note, also for treatment and control groups here, there are equal level of healthcare centers available past the treatment. So there is no difference in access to healthcare between my treatment and my control group. For women's employment, we're only going to be including women of more than 15 years old to avoid that they're not working due to school. And we're just going to have a dummy that equals 1 when a woman indicates that she's employed. So 0 when she's not employed and due to household or childcare tasks that they indicated. Again, we don't have any general unemployment effects of having been occupied. There are no differences between the two groups. And it's also not the case that people moved from within a sector of employment, so to say. So it's not like they moved from working for a bank, whatever, to working on a farm. We don't see any general employment changes there. If we then perform pretty much the same regression as before, we see that people who have been exposed to Boko Haram are about 10% less likely to use to be open to using healthcare. So in this case, use medication, for example. And we also find about a 16% drop in women working outside of the house, so having outside of the house employment, which both indicate that we see a sort of convergence of behavior with Boko Haram's ideology that these people have been exposed to. Summarizing what I just said, we find the 10% and the 16%. So some concluding remarks. We found that being exposed to Boko Haram's anti-educational ideology during this occupation leads to a 22% reduction in school attendance in the years after occupation, relative to those who also experienced the conflict, but are not as highly exposed to the group's ideology. And we showed there's no strong evidence to assume that the reduction in school attendance is due to child labor, child health, or school supply. And additionally, we found support for the identification strategy by estimating the effect of exposure to ideology on healthcare usage and women's employment. And that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Anna will provide some comments now.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Let me just make it into a slideshow. Okay, can everybody see the screens? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So very interesting topic. I very much enjoyed reading the paper and the results as well. I think it's quite relevant and important research question that's kind of ongoing, and especially given that most previous studies focused on mostly violence itself, but not relatively to like the exposure to ideology. And you explored different data sources in this study as well, using panel data, and examined other outcomes, not just, so you try to explain the mechanism behind, okay, what could be driving the drop in school attendance after being exposed to extensively to this ideology. So I have a bunch of questions and comments, and it might be because I'm not really familiar with this, the setting and the whole history and the background behind it, but let me just go ahead. So I guess my main question, I guess, with regards to the identification strategy, like when I researched into this, the region and the Boko Haram insurgency, how different is that occupation itself from earlier years of insurgency that kind of turned into a violent insurgency since 2009, right? So because they were already present in that region, I think the northeastern regions were most exposed to that presence from before. So I'm just wondering, okay, yes, I mean, actual takeover is much different from being exposed to this conflict, ongoing conflict, but I'm just wondering how different is it before 2009, or comparing between the two groups before 2013. And I know you showed the parallel trends and all that, but I think that would be important to kind of emphasize and elaborate in your paper. So where they chose, or I guess they succeeded in controlling these areas in the northeastern regions, I think in the 3 states, it's probably not random, right? So that they target mainly areas that are more accepting of their ideology or easier to target, less people. I don't know what could be driving the decisions to target these areas. I think it's primarily coming from one state, if I understood correctly. So what could be driving that, right? I think that kind of explanation is missing in your paper. And in terms of the education itself, I think my questions are, okay, what are the consequences for not abiding the mandatory schooling law? I think in other countries in Africa, they have these mandatory schooling law, but still many people don't really follow that. And does that change in accordance to the takeover, right? Because it's not the government who's in control in these regions, they might be thinking, oh, we don't really have to abide by these laws, or, you know, they might have that perception as well. So you might want to consider that, and some implications for the control and their occupation and on education. I would think about resources and funding and operation of schools. Like how does that, like, does it like completely disconnect every channel that they have with their government? Could that be correlated with possible declines or improvements? I don't know, or just the same in terms of school quality funding or other school resources, like, or did they get more resources externally? I don't know. I mean, if they wanted to instill their own ideology, they might have approached a totally different style or educational policy compared to the previous government. So I think that could be some of the things that you might want to consider. And that could be one of the contributing factors that led to the drop in the school attendance, especially for non-mandatory school-age children. If they think that, if the parents think that, oh, it's not really high quality as before, I don't want to send my kids. I mean, they might be better off just staying at home working, or staying safe. In terms of the data, I think it would be helpful to have more description of the data, because I was like, okay, is this a panel data? Is this a cross section? I was a little bit confused. Maybe it's just me, but and And also, if you're estimating a linear probability model or probit model, I couldn't tell from the empirical strategy section, but I think it's I think you're talking about linear probability model. But and can you identify who moved just before the occupation or moved out of that state? So if you want to see if you can follow individuals over time, like control for at least like how many years they lived in that region, right? For example, or just exclude to those people who never moved or something like that within the treatment and the control group. To even if it drops the number of samples, the observations that you have, I think that might get you at a cleaner identification. So that's the same comment on the next one, right? If they had the means to escape before because they knew that it was already coming, and especially in that main region, they were severely affected by it because they had the headquarter of Boko Haram. It should be BH, sorry, Boko Haram in Borno, right? So if they knew that it was the headquarter for that group, they might have been more likely to move out, right? I mean, especially for those parents who worried about their children's future or their family's future. I mean, I'm just saying that could be a possible hypothesis. So I think that information would be important if you have that. And then I don't think I saw anything on the socioeconomic status of the household. So it may be control for that as well. But I know you have individual fixed effects and all. But so when I looked at the table, I saw that there were no secondary schools within those LGA and after they took over. So I was a little bit confused. So they had no secondary schools in both. So I couldn't understand why, but I mean, you might have an answer to that, but it might be worth trying to exclude that, just focus on the primary school. If that's, I mean, for whatever reason, you have 0 students who said there is secondary schools in their neighborhood, then just drop them and see what happens. Have you just tried restricting the sample only to the Borno region? Because I think it might be different. There might be differences across different states, right? So, and possibly conducting event study or synthetic controls method, right? So try to find a different control group other than the regions that you're exploring. It could be somewhere else where that never really were exposed to that ideology compared to the Northeastern region, right? So that might be a possibility. Or you could try even triple diff and diff, right? I mean, if you have the data from different regions, like I think that might be much stronger. I would prefer to doing either synthetic controls or triple diff and diff in your case. I guess additional background information would be helpful in terms of the difference. I mean, there are some differences that I found. I mean, the magnitudes were small, but significantly different. So population density, I think almost everyone in the treatment group said that they're in the rural household, as opposed to the control group. There were more, I guess, variations in terms of urban and rural, but, you know, just try to describe that a little bit more. And when you're talking about school and violent events, I think you use like total numbers, but I think it might be more important to look at the intensity or the how many per capita, right? Because especially if the treatment groups are primarily rural and they might be further away, you know, they might be exposed to less schools, fewer schools, I guess, in the region, et cetera, right? So same goes for like the teachers and per school or per the neighborhood, I guess, within the neighborhood. And exposure to violence, I wasn't sure why different periods for the Boko Haram controlled areas versus you had different years in table 810. But I mean, why not look at every year like you do in other tables? And I think it might be helpful to have an analogous version of table A9 with the significance test and the same time period, because you're comparing the same thing, right? With the same time period. And then I'm not sure if I saw this, but do you control for violence measures in the main analysis? If not, maybe you should try that. And intensity of violence measures, same thing like I explained with the schools resources. I think that would be helpful to capture the intensity. I think this is my last slide, but I think it's very interesting that you looked at the healthcare and the employment outcomes for women. But maybe I would try not to devote as much attention. I mean, this is very nice extension, but your main focus should be the educational outcome, right? As the title suggests. So I think this should be more like I guess an extension or a robustness check. So, and using medicine as purchasing any medicine as the outcome is a good proxy, I guess, in general, but I think it might suggest an access issue, because if you look at the table A2 and A8, I think the treatment group had some pharmacy available prior to the control, but from 2015 there was 0. So maybe this effect that you're getting is not because that they decided to not purchase the medicine, but maybe it's the access issue. Sorry, it's my cat. The pharmacy is not existing, right? Maybe that's why it's driving that significant negative effect. Why not? I think you talked about doctor visit in your paper as well. So why not use that as an outcome, right? Controlling for any case of injury, right? To kind of proxy for healthcare usage. Because the presence of health centers don't tend to change drastically. I mean, they do change, but not to 0. So I think that is a more, I guess, plausible mechanism to kind of get at the healthcare usage.
Anna?
Oh, am I
sorry,
running
I
out of
think I'm
time?
going to cut you off because we have only 2 minutes left, and I want to give Nicole a chance to say something
sorry.
in response.
I didn't check the time. I was like, oh my goodness, I had too much
Yeah.
things to say. Sorry about that. But yeah, I can share
Go
the
ahead,
slides
Nicole,
later.
if you have.
Yeah.
No, I just want to say thank you. There's lots of really, really good points. Interestingly, you point some things out that I thought I had changed in the paper, or adjusted, like the different time years, for example, and apparently I didn't. But yeah, thank you so much, because this is really, really useful. And something that indeed I did, or I touched upon, but I didn't adjust or didn't mention it clearly enough, so it's incredibly helpful. So I can email you about slides later, probably. That would be super great. Thank you.
Sure, I can do that. Yes.
And then Amit, did you have anything else that you wanted to say, since we also kind of had to cut you off in response to the comments?
I'll just make one comment. Thank you for those comments to Nicole. The one comment that I would want to make is that the idea of resilience is used in 2 different senses in the ecology literature where the term originated. And a lot of economists, regional scientists, social scientists don't understand that. And they use it in different ways and then introduce multiple meanings. So resilience, unfortunately, is becoming like sustainability. It has like 1,000 meanings, depending on who you talk to. So the point to understand is that in the ecology literature, when Buzz Holling was talking about resilience, resilience is a far from equilibrium concept. So the idea is, what is the size of the stability domain? What is the extent of the shock that a system can absorb and yet retain its current composition, structure, functions, etc.? That's the sense in which I am thinking about resilience. But the other notion is due to Stuart Pym, an ecologist at Duke. That's more like an engineering concept. I shock a system, how long does it take before it gets back to its original state? So I'm not interested in the system getting back to its original state, because original state would be H0. That's the long run steady state. I want to do better than that. So I'm thinking about what is the size of the stability domain, which in this particular case would translate to what action or actions do I need to take to ensure probabilistically that the health status stays above whatever I've determined H sub M to be, 0.7, 0.8, etc. So that's one distinction that's important to keep in mind, a far from equilibrium versus near equilibrium concepts of resilience.
Okay, that explains it. Yeah, that's really good to know. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our marathon 2.5 hour, longest ever during COVID panel session. I thank you all for your really interesting work that you've done. Thanks to all the discussants as well. Please remember to send your slides if you had any, or your comments if you had anything written down, to the authors, and I'm sure we will all appreciate those.